Assalamu alaikum. I am about to take up the thread of my discussion, which I started earlier, basically about Islam and how it has affected people in the Caribbean region. But now I want to take it to where the Caribbean people's presence in Britain becomes a factor in Islam now becoming a part of what happens in their culture, in their community, in England, in London, in Leeds, in Cardiff, wherever you find Bristol, where Caribbean people came in the 50s and 60s, who were for most part of Christian, Pentecostal, usually evangelical, Pentecostal, Catholic, Anglican provenance. Islam began to affect these communities, and this is what I want to talk about right now. The earliest signs of Islam in the Caribbean community in England can be traced back as early as the 50s. And it was a case of individuals more than whole groups of people becoming Muslim. And I think you have to look at it as a sort of cross-fertilization between what was happening in North America and what was happening in black communities in the diaspora everywhere else. In North America, a lot of people were becoming Muslim, and it was a reaction to inequality, civil rights problems, and that sort of, a similar sort of thing was happening in England, where black people who had arrived here from the Caribbean and some from Africa began to feel disenfranchised. There was a lot of problems with racism, and Islam seemed to be a rallying call to which they would gravitate. But as individuals, people who were in touch, there's the famous or infamous Michael X from Trinidad, who traveled a lot between England and North America, and he had notions of a particular orientation of Islam, and there was an older brother who was a close friend of his called Sa'dallah, and you can almost count as one of the earliest African, I think he was in fact the earliest African Caribbean convert to Islam in this country. He arrived here in the late 40s, he became a Muslim in the 50s and went traveling in the Middle East with a friend of his from Trinidad called Hamid, whom I haven't seen in many, many years. Sadallah sadly has now passed on. He died in 2010, I believe it was, 2011. I think it was 2011. And Islam in the Caribbean community is mostly about, in the beginning, in the 70s then, 60s and 70s, it was mostly about a reaction to what was, to racism. It was basically a reaction. It was a sort of like call towards nationalism. It was a search for identity, pretty much like what happened with the Rasta movement. The two all came together. The Rasta movement for a time, at least in the 70s, was the more dynamic of the two. But as time went on, I don't know if the actual death of Haile Selassie had anything to do with dispelling the notion that he was God. But the Islam, after a while, gathered momentum and surpassed Rastafari as a kind of expression of resistance, an expression of national unity. And this was happening a lot. The first mosque that I know of established in London was in Ladbroke Grove, and that was called Masjid al-Rujua, and that was established around 1982-83. Sheikh Sa'dallah was the Emir, and we had a scholar from Sierra Leone called Sheikh Salah Janneh, who also has sadly passed away in 2010. He was a da'i in this country from the late 70s, and it was that helped to bring about a sort of like to gather all the disparate strands of the Caribbean community and get them to sort of meet for Jummah in one central location. The problem has always been one of demographics. The Caribbean community, those who converted, as I said before earlier, converted as individuals. They'd be living scattered as isolated individuals in different parts of London. And Sheikh Salah and Sheikh Sa'dallah, they both tried to create a Jummah that would get people together. This lasted for a time, and of course I believe it was a public property building they had to give back. And most of the people from that community moved to a brother's house in South London, 25 Belfields Road in Brixton. And that brother sadly also passed away, a lovely human being called Omar, actually gave up his home to be converted, to be used as a masjid. All floors, every part of his house, there was no part where we did not pray, and that house was always full of believers. And even though it was near to another mosque in Stockwell, near enough, people would come there for the quality of the sort of khutbah you would get in that particular mosque. And then eventually, from there, we moved to Gresham Road. It was called ICM. And that was not just a mosque, as in terms of a place to pray. It was also a housing association and a welfare institution for people of the convert or the revert community, many of whom had been basically disowned and abandoned by their families because they became Muslims. And so this community acted as a hub, and as I still think it does in Brixton to this day, for that community. After a time, Sheikh Salah left there, and they established the North Brixton community. And then, while that was happening, on the other side of the river, in Kilburn, Masjid al-Taqwa, also dealing with the problems of the revert or the convert community, was also established, which later split into Masjid al-Taqwa and Masjid al-Nur, and things are pretty much like that today. The two communities, one dealing with the situation of the revert community in Harlesden, and that's Masjid al-Taqwa, whilst Masjid al-Nur is located in Acton W3. Both trying to deal with the peculiar problems that you find in the revert community. So up to the, let's say, the mid-80s, the tendency towards conversion in the African Caribbean, which was large at that point, it tended to be more about identity. It was more of an identity issue, and the sort of problems you have when you come into a country where you're not respected, you're not valued. And we all know what happened with the Enoch Powell days when we said, your labor was what we wanted, now the labor problem is solved, you may as well go back home. This religion, Islam, gave people a sense of identity, as it did in America. But towards the end of the 80s and 90s, there was a different generation of African Caribbean and African Muslims coming into Islam. It was less about an affirmation of identity, and it was more about a sense of anomie, a sense of isolation, a sense of anonymity, a sense of being lost in a world where there was a lot of knowledge. This coincided with the rise in internet technology, cyberspace. There was more that people could read, but less people seemed to know. And there was this, and also there was another kind of resistance coming out of America, as one brother always reminds me to factor in, and that was the notion of rap music and the impact that that had on that late 80s and up to mid-90s generation. And that has also got to be factored into how a lot of the early ones were Muslims, and they had a profound influence on young Muslims in the 90s who were coming to Islam. It was resistance politics, but not as racially orientated as the Islam in my particular era, which is in the late 60s and the early 70s. Then there is a third period you can talk about, and I'm talking about this in tranches: the 60s, the 80s, the 90s, and then in the noughties. There's another kind of Islam, and to me that it almost seems to be a rejuvenation of the religion, but at the same time, it's as if the religion never happened before. It's as if there's a constant break in the narrative as to what Islam is. So what appeared to be happening at this stage is that the latest generation of converts appear to be rediscovering the religion all by themselves. And that has got to be taken into account when discussing any development of Islam in the African Caribbean community in England. Assalamu alaikum.